President Trump has just announced a ceasefire in the war between Israel and Iran.
The president just posted on Truth Social moments ago saying, quote, a ceasefire has been, quote, fully agreed to by Israel and Iran. There will be a complete and total ceasefire 6 hours from now. Again, this just happened.
But that doesn't mean we get to breathe a sigh of relief just yet. We've seen recent ceasefires collapse almost immediately after being agreed to.
The ceasefire in Gaza has been shattered after Israel carried out deadly strikes against Hamas.
All right, more than 400 people have been killed in what's now the deadliest day in the region since November of 2023.
To see if this agreement will actually lead to lasting peace in the region, I'm happy to welcome on this show's resident foreign policy expert, Griffin Phil. Griffin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Micah. It's great to be here.
Griffin, before we can understand if this war is truly at an end, we need to first understand how it started. How and why did Israel start this war?
So I think it's a two-part answer. First of all is the sort of nuclear aspect to it. The Iranians have been pursuing some sort of nuclear program for the past several decades. They've consistently insisted that it is peaceful in nature. They do have several nuclear power plants, and some elements of their nuclear program are clearly oriented towards civilian power. It's not entirely a sham in that it actually has produced things, but it also seems pretty clear that significant portions of the regime, at the very least, see the nuclear program as a way to hide their acquisition of nuclear weapons. You don't build a peaceful nuclear program and then build these massive underground bases to hide that peaceful nuclear program from the enemy's bombers. So the Iranians have been pretty open about that, to be perfectly honest. The supreme leader theoretically has condemned nuclear weapons and said that Iran shouldn't get them. But on the other hand, he's also said that if Iran was ever pushed, he could change his mind and then they would have nuclear weapons. So that's, I guess, part one, is that there is a very real threat of Iran getting nuclear weapons, and it's become increasingly real as the years have gone by. Second of all is that Iran has made itself a sort of implacable foe to Israel. The Iranians consistently chant and scream, Israel must be destroyed. They see Israel as a little Satan and are sort of errand boy in the region who is plotting their destruction. Islamic fundamentalists, more broadly, of course, are fanatically anti-Israel, but Iran has shown themselves to be willing to put their money where their mouth is and dedicate a significant amount of their country's resources to the destruction of Israel in one capacity or another. So you can't exactly be surprised that the Israelis see a nuclear weapons program as a direct threat to them.
Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels, Hamas, a lot of H-starting organizations that are very notable. We've heard about them a lot, all funded by Iran, principally by Iranian state. So Israel doesn't want their number one chief enemy in the region, the one that they're constantly fighting with in proxy wars, to have nuclear weapons because they're worried that those nuclear weapons will be used against Israel, or at least, I suppose, shield Iran from attacks from Israel because of the threat of nuclear reciprocation. So that answers the why this war started. How did it actually start? They've been fighting each other, these proxy wars, for a long time, but the actual combat between these two nations has increased in intensity so much that we've actually started referring to it as a war about 11 days ago. What happened to start that?
So this war was made possible by October 7th. Hamas's decision to attack Israel on October 7th basically opened the door to this, because traditionally everyone knew that the Israelis could attack Iran if they wanted to. Nobody really believed that Iran could stop Israel from doing that. The threat that always held Israel back was that Iran would retaliate through its proxies, that Hezbollah would launch massive rocket strikes, that Hamas would attack at the same time, that the Houthis, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, the Assad regime, every single group that was aligned with Iran would all gang up on Israel and attack at the same time. And instead, Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, his decision to attack Israel and then a few months later draw Hezbollah into it, and then a few months later draw the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq into it, has allowed the Israelis to basically fight every single one of Iran's proxy groups one at a time. And now the Assad regime is gone. Hezbollah is shattered. Hamas is basically in hiding within pockets of Gaza. The Houthis, their command and control system has been badly disrupted, and they don't have the offensive capacity that they did a year ago either. So Iran's shield of proxy groups has essentially collapsed. And because of that collapse, now Israel feels willing to challenge Iran directly and strike.
I see. So Israel has eviscerated Iran's ability to really strike back, except in the ways that they have, which have been limited in effectiveness. But I suppose the other part of this question is, like, what did Israel actually do initially to start this conflict? They did targeted strikes, right, on a certain number of locations in Iran, right?
Yeah, so I think this really shows very well how if you're targeting someone's nuclear program with airstrikes, you're not just targeting the nuclear program, because you can't simply attack a nuclear site and that's it. As the Israeli target lists have shown, how do you have the skies open to attack a nuclear facility? You have to destroy someone's air defense system. And how do you make sure that their retaliation is relatively chaotic and limited? You destroy their ballistic missile capacity and you target the generals that are responsible for making the decision to fire those missiles. And how do you kill the scientists that run the nuclear program? You bomb apartment buildings in the capital city that have those scientists in them. So, these are limited strikes, no doubt. And I think generally speaking, they are targeted towards the destruction of the nuclear program. But it does show that, destroying a nuclear program is more in practice than just blowing up a bunch of bunkers in the middle of the desert. There's a lot more to it. I think there's a stronger argument in the last few days that the Iranians have been subject to broader strikes. We've seen attacks against sort of internal security and regime militia headquarters and various targets that wouldn't necessarily be directly linked to the regime's ability to carry out and protect its nuclear program, but are, I say, more broadly pillars of support for the Iranian regime.
And so what are the notable strikes that we should know about?
So the first wave of strikes, the Israeli strikes, these were focused on destroying targets that Israel could destroy. So these were scientific facilities above ground, some outlying sites in the more fortified nuclear positions, military headquarters, air defense sites, and particularly the facilities from which the Iranians launch their ballistic missiles against Israel to try and deny Iran the ability to strike back. They've also struck facilities that aren't related to that, like the regime's state TV propaganda facilities, and several headquarters that are used by the internal security forces. And these are the guys that are responsible for crushing internal dissent, the religious police, groups like that are the brutal enforcers of the Iranian regime.
So this is the first wave of strikes. What was Iran's response to that first wave?
So we saw then essentially a tit-for-tat, back and forth series of strikes where the Iranians would launch, I think the first two waves were 50 each, 50 sort of medium-range ballistic missiles. Most of these missiles, about 80 to 90%, depending on the wave, were intercepted by Israel's missile defense systems. Colloquially, we call all of this the Iron Dome. Technically, the longer range ballistic missile defense isn't the Iron Dome. It's part of different programs, but most Americans think of it as just the Iron Dome. So the Israeli missile defense has been very effective. Some people have been killed, something like I think 25 Israeli civilians were killed. But considering that they launched something like 400 ballistic missiles, that's a very impressive achievement on the part of the Israeli missile defense. And then there's been, as I said, this back and forth strikes where every time the Iranians launched a volley of missiles, the Israeli Air Force would go out and try and destroy the launchers and destroy the sites from which they had launched the missiles to prevent the Iranians from firing further volleys. And then the Israelis would then go out and strike other targets once they had finished off as many of the ballistic missile launchers as they could. The destruction of those other targets would then move Iran to fire more volleys and back and forth and back and forth. And we've seen that really for the last 10 days now. And that's, of course, ended not ended fully, but that's seen to the climax of those have been the U.S. strikes and our direct involvement against the Iranians.
And so that's the question we're coming to. You mentioned phase one, them hitting the targets that they can hit. Now let's talk about phase two. These are the strikes on the locations where they actually needed American help. What were those locations, and what was the United States' involvement helping to facilitate those strikes?
So the three primary core locations of the Iranian nuclear program are bases at Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordow. And Fordow is probably the one that's the most famous to the American ears now. That's where the vast majority of our bunker buster bombs were used. Natanz has some underground facilities that were also hit by bunker busters. Isfahan was above ground, and we just smashed that with submarine-launched cruise missiles. But Fordow was the essential site. It's this massive, sprawling underground bunker facility built into the side of a mountain in central Iran. And it was designed specifically to be resistant or impervious, they hoped impervious, to American bunker buster bombs. And that's why we used so many. One of these bombs was basically designed to destroy any underground facility. I think we used 9 or 12 on Fordow. So we used an amount of firepower that in any other facility anywhere else on Earth would have been considered overkill. But it still is unclear exactly how much damage we did to Fordow. The president has said that it was completely destroyed, obliterated, and it's finished. Vice President Vance seems less sure. He said that there was substantial damage, but also said that some nuclear material was able to be evacuated from the site before we destroyed it. The Iranians, of course, claim that there was almost no damage, but they're hardly a reliable source. They've been completely fabricating things from day one in this. I would not say the Iranian regime is a reliable source of information by any means.
Well, they said they shot down an Israeli F-35.
They've said they've shot down 5 F-35s, and they've yet to show a single piece of evidence or show us any of the pilots they supposedly captured.
Well, they showed photos, and we'll put up one of those photos right now, of the plane they claim is one of the downed F-35s, although the resident plane experts that I follow on social media say that there's some huge discrepancies between how F-35s actually look and how the image they showed, the plane in the image they showed looks. So I'm dubious of that claim. And I'm skeptical they even have the technology that would make that possible, right?
Yeah, they really don't. I think the Iranians, we've been very afraid of them for their proxy networks. But a country like Iran, even though it has a significant amount of oil wealth, it has a limited amount of money. And every dollar that they've spent on those proxy networks has been a dollar they have not spent on their conventional armed forces at home. And a consequence of that has been that the Iranian air defenses are very outdated. The Iranian Air Force is essentially a joke. So the Iranians have had very little ability to resist or counter the Israeli strikes within Iran. They've only been able to retaliate, and that's because the sort of strategic choices they made and how they've spent their money, it's left Iran very vulnerable.
Right. So now a ceasefire deal has been struck. This is announced by the president on Truth Social, and he announced it before Israel and Iran had seemingly put the memo out to all their senior officials. So there's a lot of confusion on social media as journalists were asking questions to senior officials in these countries, and they either refused to comment or outright denied that the deal had been struck. But now it seems that the memo has been released, and the countries have seemed to say that they've bought into the ceasefire deal, even if a little bit indirectly, especially in the case of Iran, where they're not very eager to say they are ceasing hostilities with countries they've sworn to seek the utter destruction of. So talk to me a little bit more about what the ceasefire deal means, how it was struck, and then we'll talk about whether it's going to stick around.
So the ceasefire it's a somewhat strange version of a ceasefire. It seems like what basically happened behind the scenes was that after the U.S. struck the Iranian nuclear facilities, then the next day, that is today, 2 days later, but the timing is off because it's Middle Eastern time. the Iranians launched a wave of missiles at the U.S. base in Qatar. It was a much smaller wave than it could have been. They warned the United States and Qatar before they launched these missiles. It was very much a symbolic strike, which is what the president said. It was just meant to sort of show their protest, I suppose, as to what we had done to them. As soon as that was launched, the United States, it seems, worked with Qatar, which was the country that was just attacked. But the Qataris, I suppose, swallowed their pride. And we talked to the Israelis, the Qataris talked to the Iranians, and we worked out some sort of agreement where Israel, about 3 a.m. Iran time, would stop attacking Iran. And if that happened, then the Iranians would not launch any further strikes against Israel. That's the way the Iranians like to sell it. They're saying it's not a ceasefire. We're just saying that if Israel ceases fire, so will we. But it's not a ceasefire. That's the Iranian position. But I think what probably happened is that the Israelis were sort of dragged into this by Trump, who has really made it clear, it seemed, that he wants peace. And he was happy to do these precision strikes against the Iranians, but he fancies himself a peacemaker. I think he really wants a Nobel Peace Prize, and he does not want to be dragged into a war in the Middle East, a broader regional war, when he ran so much both in 2016 and 2020 as a different sort of Republican who wouldn't fight a war in the Middle East.
Yeah, his base was crucifying him over even the decision to strike Iran. And also his tweet, which talked about making Iran great again by having regime change, which he mentions is a term that's a controversial term, but he prefers make Iran great again, and he thinks that it might be necessary.
He said it wasn't politically correct to use the word regime change.
But that's not going to stop him.
Yeah, exactly. I think his version of political correctness apparently comes much more from what J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard would like to have the president saying, more than the New York Times or CNN being the arbiters of political correctness. So yeah, I think it's a very distinctly Trump setup here. It's all him from a style point of view. It's chaotic. It's jumping around, unclear what's going on. It's I want peace, but also regime change sounds sort of interesting. We'll see what happens. Maybe a regional war. Maybe I'll get a Nobel Peace Prize. Who knows?
We also mentioned that he was going to take 2 weeks to make his decision, and he made his decision in 2 days. So that was certainly interesting. He talks about a ceasefire, and literally minutes later, we find out that Israel is actually dropping more bombs on Iran.
I want to check now. There was talk. Yes. So the Israelis are saying as of 5 minutes ago that the Iranians are launching more rockets at Israel, which is in contravention from, as far as I know, with the time difference. That's breaking the ceasefire. But we'll see. I think big picture, this may be a rocky few days of getting the ceasefire settled. But I think the U.S. is, the Trump administration, as the U.S. is firmly interested now in getting this stitched up and moving on. Whether that happens or not, I think will be unpredictable, I suppose. But I think the Iranians generally want peace. I think that they don't know how to salvage the situation anymore. There's not much they can do to make it seem less of a defeat. So I think the only people who would like this to continue is Israel, because they're winning. And they know they're winning. And they're not stupid. They'd like to press the advantage and see how many Guard Corps bases they can destroy, how many nuclear scientists they can kill, how many ballistic missile bases they can blow up. They'd like to see how far they can go, but I think the U.S. is going to start pretty aggressively reeling them in, because I think Trump does want this stitched up, and I think he does not want a regional war.
I see. Well, folks, if by the time you watch this, there's a full-on hot war between Israel and Iran, and perhaps the United States once again, just remember, we've recorded this on June 23rd, okay? And we're not taking a firm position that there will not be any conflict. We're leaning in favor of the idea that this will come to a resolution over the next couple of days. But if we're wrong, well, God bless us all. Get ready for the draft.
Fair enough.
You're not safe, Griffin. Get ready for the draft.
Sounds good. Take care, Micah.
Thanks for watching, guys.